Proxmox has released a new beta version of their virtualization software, version 7. So this builds upon version 6.4, which is the current stable release, and gives a few new features and mostly just upgrades a lot of the internal software they're using. Today I'm going to go take a look at that software, install it on a PC, try it and see what works, see if there's any kind of issues, and just play around with it. I'm also going to install 6.7 with a few VMs and see how that upgrade to 7 goes, to see if it kind of breaks anything other than the known potential issues, and just see how smooth an upgrade is. So this release was first released online on their forum page. So here's the forum post right here of the release from their Proxmox staff, with a quick intro of it. Some of the big features they show is a new version of Ceph, with Ceph Pacific 16.2 as the default. BTRFS support, so it looks like they're adding support for snapshots. If that works, I'd love to play with it, because I am kind of a fanboy of BTRFS, even though unfortunately it really hasn't lived up to my hopes when it comes to things like RAID 5 and 6, and I've had numerous issues with it in the past. There's a new IF up-down 2 is now the default for bringing up and down network cards, or virtual network adapters. Commu 6.0 is now the default, so which does change a few I/O things, and it also just brings all the Commu features and updates and bug fixes, and they say countless GUI improvements and much more. There's also a quick Q&A on it, which essentially says you can upgrade it via apt from 6.4 to 7. You can also upgrade from 7 beta to the unreleased 7 stable if you want to in the future. And they say there's no date for the next version, it's just going to be released when the bugs are fixed. So probably based off the other ones within a couple months. Looking at the roadmap page on their website, they give a little bit more details of exactly what's going on. It has about a page or two of a lot more detail. So of the things they've done, first of all, it's just a lot of the internal software. A lot of Proxmox is built upon other people's code and kind of putting it together in a nice package. So there's a newer version of the Linux kernel, newer version of the Debian, and all the Debian utils under the hood, ZFS, LXC, Commu, all of those. And you get all the improvements with those versions, which is great. The interesting thing with BTRFS is I don't see BTRFS mentioned in the release history for the beta. It could be not in the beta one, but it's also in the roadmap and not listed with a potential date. It does say it's done, no, so that's interesting. We'll have to see once we try it. They say the actual install improvements, so a few low-level tweaks on how that works. They also have said they improved high DPI. My guess is it's going to be pretty much the same. We'll find out. Web interface had a few improvements, language support. One of the more interesting features I found is backup and restore. It looks like you can now encrypt the backups that you make. I'll have to see how that works. I'm also curious how that would work with PBS, or the Proxmox backup server, if it's encrypted before it ever goes to Proxmox backup, or how that's set up. A lot of small changes. The other thing they list is breaking changes, so what's gonna break. Issues, nothing too big. The biggest one I can see is potential renaming of the virtual network cards. Sometimes this can be annoying if you're naming things, so hopefully we'll see if that works in my testing. Overall, looking at the change logs and features they've listed, nothing seems too crazy. It appears to be a relatively minor change under the hood. A lot of nice things to have, but nothing that is going to revolutionize the use of Proxmox. Now that I've gone over the change list, I've downloaded it and put it on this USB stick, and I'm going to just try putting it on this older Dell Optiplex now, and see how it goes. And now I'm in the installer page for Proxmox 7 Beta. This looks pretty much like the other ones that have been there. Looking at the options now, I see BTRFS as an option. Let's try just doing a BTRFS RAID 0, which I believe is the only way of doing a single drive in BTRFS. Actually, let's do RAID 1 for a single drive. That's interesting. It does note that it is a preview feature, but we're going to just give it a try today. This page looks exactly the same. I do believe I have an internet connection right now. It'd be great if they could have it automatically find my time zone using it. I forget if it does it. I know some Linux distros do that. I have heard it is a potential privacy concern because it is reaching out and finding out where you are. It looks like it's already gone and grabbed some information from my DHCP server and made that the default static IP, but I can change it to be whatever I want. It detects my network card correctly in the system, and everything looks fine, and I'm going to hit install. Now, of the features I'd like to see them add in the installer, I'd say the big ones are I'd like to see a network installer that would automatically grab the latest packages for Debian and Proxmox and install them. I've seen a few other distros do it, like Debian does it, I believe Ubuntu can, and Fedora. And that makes it so you don't have to do a updates or anything after you do the install. You already have the latest version when you've done it. Saves me a bit of time. Next thing I'd like to see is a better version with like kind of the traditional Debian installer that has no GUI at all. Sometimes I don't have a keyboard, and sometimes it's just nicer to do it with the virtual graphics that sometimes servers have, or doing it over a text console. The one thing I do like with this installer is how fast it is. I am very happy, and Proxmox installs, and this is installing on a hard drive too. It is quite zippy to install and pretty much always has been. And I'd say that install was pretty fast, about 5 minutes total including the information I had to put in, which is pretty nice to have an OS installs fast, saves me time, and it's using the standard grub UEFI bootloader, and should boot very quickly into Debian. Also, I'm going to mention I'm running this all on a hard drive, just because I had it laying around, and performance is actually on Proxmox pretty okay for booting from a hard drive, because it just really doesn't need much I/O, which is great that it can get away with running on relatively slow drives. And now this system's been successfully installed and working, and I can start looking at the web interface. One cool thing that Firefox had a little bit ago is it can now save passwords for Proxmox, which I really love, because for a while no browser would do it. I get the standard no subscription message, and then it looks like a normal system. I see BTRFS on here, but I want to set up another data store for my data. I put in a Sun F40 SSD, which is 4 100 gig SSDs, and let's try setting them up. So they continue to improve the disk management in the GUI. I used to do this more and more in the command line, but now they've added things like wiping it, so you're starting to get a relatively usable, you can do it all in the GUI if you'd like. So now I can see like my SDA is the boot drive, and all of these are my SSDs. It definitely gives you the warning of wiping delete your data, but you can now do that. So now let's try setting up these drives with BTRFS and see how that goes. So first of all, we have to initialize it with a partition table, so GPT. And now that it's done, we can have an initialized disk, and we can set it up with a file system. And actually, they don't seem to have a GUI built in for creating BTRFS. So if I do create directory, I get ext4 and xfs. And if I look at like the different ones, I see LVM, LVM thin, directory, and ZFS. So it doesn't seem to be present. Now if I go into the pure storage management, I might see my BTRFS. And there it is right there. So it says it's a tech preview, and it looks like because it is a... So let's dive into that command line and start playing around with getting BTRFS set up. So I can just do it, and then I'm going to do sudo mkfs.btrfs/dev/sdb/. Every once in a while I go and continue to check to see the BTRFS wiki to see if they've kind of fixed some of the issues I've been having, mostly with RAID 5 and RAID 6, and a few more of the smaller ones, and unfortunately they haven't. BTRFS was really kind of my dream feature set in a file system, looking at just the specs alone, because it lets you do mixed drive size as well. It lets you do easily changing RAID levels. They kind of in the beginning said they do even higher levels of parity. It does snapshots, but from all of my uses, it really never lived up to be the ZFS replacement for Linux that I was kind of hoping it would be, and it turned out to be a reasonable file system, just not incredible. Now that I've created the file system, I can make the directory to mount it onto, and I can just mount my drives. Any of the drives in BTRFS can be used if you have a multi-disk setup, and mount it there, and then it's ready to be used. If I was doing this long term, you'd want to mount it via like fstab or something, so it mounts automatically at boot. But now that I've had a BTRFS volume mounted, let's take a look at how that would work to create it. So I have my ID, so we're going to call it warp drive BTRFS, and path we're going to do /mnt/BTRFS. Looking at the content, they allow you to store anything on it, which is kind of nice, so you can store backups and all of that, all nodes, and it continues to tell you that it is a beta. They have a backup retention. I think one other thing they said they changed in 7 is by default, it can now store multiple backups on a volume instead of just having one. So that's an error. Unexpected property prune backups. So let's remove the backup file capability and then add it. That's odd. It looks like when I add storage with BTRFS, I'm not sure if it's just BTRFS, if I have keep all backups selected, it won't let me do it. That's interesting. I've added a Fedora Workstation ISO, so we're going to try just making that ISO on the BTRFS volume and see how that goes. So we're going to call it Fedora WS1, and looking through the install procedure, I'm installing from the local hard drive I have. It's on there. I'm going to use just fully defaults for most things. Yeah, I believe they've changed how it works with data storage, but the default will be fine. I know BTRFS has had some performance issues with VMs, depending on exactly how it's set up. Part of it is due to it being a cow file system, and copy on write's generally not great. Give it a couple cores. Oh, one other thing I wish they could do, that I haven't found in Proxmox, is have a way to either default it to another one. It was probably a config file for it, but I haven't seen it. And on a single node cluster, I'd vote either ASCII or just change it to host, because host normally gives you the best performance. They default to KVM64, which gives you the most compatibility, which is nice for a cluster, but in a single node, you probably want it to be at host. And also, generally, with a single node, if you are upgrading your VMs later, you are likely upgrading them to something newer, so the having the newest version already isn't probably going to be an issue. So let's fire up this VM and see what it looks like. So now I have my Fedora Workstation running, and let's just try doing a little install on this VM. Nothing special. It's hypervisor, it runs VMs just fine. So the one thing I'm kind of curious about is how exactly they're doing BTRFS under the hood. So taking a little bit of a deeper look on it, if I cd to where my BTRFS is and I run tree, I can see it's laid out like basically all the other Proxmox ones. They have the dump, images, private, snippets, and templates for the different type of data, and then folders within that have normally the VM number to tell you what data it is. So in this case, for images, I can cd images, and then 100, and then the VM100 disk 1, and that's where my disk is. So then it just calls it disk.raw. And the advantages it looks like of using BTRFS here instead of just the files, because otherwise the file system would do basically the same here, is it's using BTRFS subvolumes. So if I use subvolumes list, by default it just makes one, but if I go in here and I tell it to make a snapshot of my VM, it'll likely use BTRFS to make a subvolume. And the advantage of doing that compared to there is I don't have to deal with QCow's disadvantages, and it is pretty much instant and done at a file system level, which is great. Compared to ZFS on Proxmox uses the zvols, which is essentially a virtual block device it makes. BTRFS can't do that, so it's using the .raw files instead. And I can see it does those. If I go make another snapshot, it's going to do the same thing. So I can call it test2 or w2 or whatever, and it has even more of those. And then, if it's working correctly, I can go delete, and I can remove an older one, and it'll go into the file system, tell it what to do, and it should just delete it. So we can see what it is, and there you go, it's gone. And it doesn't store the old data, and then the file system manages which exact blocks it has to keep. If maintained well, this can be pretty nice. BTRFS, I'd say, is a little more clunky compared to ZFS. ZFS has some great tools when it comes to finding out how big your snapshots and stuff are, whereas BTRFS isn't as good. It's still okay, but it's nice to have, and I think it'll meet a nice edge case for people who either like BTRFS and been using it with file before. I've done that in Proxmox. Use cases where BTRFS does make a lot of sense, or hopefully in the future BTRFS gets some of its issues resolved and kind of becomes a better go-to file system in Linux than it is today, I'd say. Another thing I was looking into was backup encryption options, because they say they've supported that now. So if I do a backup now, it says can't use type BTRFS for backup, but I don't see anything in this box that would allow me to do that. And if I go here and just look up the backup options, I don't see anything. Either it's hidden in the GUI, or maybe it wasn't included yet. Maybe I'm looking in the wrong spot. I don't believe there's any other documentation that goes over it. I'm not sure exactly how this has to be done. I don't see a good way. Hopefully there's more details in the future, because it'd be cool if you can actually encrypt your backups built into that. And then I feel a lot safer about just shoving my backups middle of nowhere and I don't care. Other than that, those are the features I care about. If you have features you want to care about and me to poke at more, let me know and I can do it. The software features is as expected. For example, the default kernel for a uname -a on it, I see it gets 5.11.22. Overall, I guess, I don't know what there is to complain about. It's the same great Proxmox that I've enjoyed for many years now and quite a few use cases, with a couple of features added and things like BTRFS and just newer software under the hood, so you get the new kind of goodies with the newer Linux kernels. I guess next thing I'm going to try is putting 6.4 on here and seeing how the upgrade process goes. Because eventually it look like I'm going to be upgrading a good amount of my Proxmox servers to 7, and I just want to see how smooth it is. And now it's time to take a look at the upgrade process from Proxmox 6.3 to 7 beta. This process is probably going to be the same for the 7 when it finally comes out, but let's take a look at it now with the beta that we have access to now. So on their page, they have a little guide that goes over the process and goes over the steps you need and things to check for before you start the upgrade. For my upgrade today, I have this system which I've gone and installed Proxmox 6.3 on. I've put a few things on, like a little virtual router on it with 2 networks. I have a little ZFS array with some SSDs for storage. I have about 5 VMs running on it right now, so I'd say it's a relatively complete small Proxmox system. It is only a single node though, so some of the steps for clusters won't apply for my testing. So taking a look at the wiki page that they have, for it, they say that you can do an in-place upgrade, which is what I'm going to do here, and what I believe a lot of other people will do if you have an existing Proxmox thing. First thing to do is to make sure you have the latest version of Proxmox 6.4, so I've had that. I have the no subscription repository, and I've just done an apt upgrade on here. The next thing they say is if you're running hyperconverged with Ceph, make sure Ceph is updated. I am not using Ceph here, so that's not relevant. They need reliable access to all configured storage, so internal SSD on ZFS should be fine. Healthy cluster, I don't have a cluster, so that doesn't apply here. Valid and tested backup of all VMs and containers, that's always recommended for any software upgrade. I don't have it in this case, I'm just testing. Correct configuration of the repositories, that will be changed, but right now it's no subscription. 4 gigs of free disk space, and then checking the known upgrade issues. Let's take a look at those known upgrade issues right now. So you have to make sure that you understand the Debian upgrades. Debian does change stuff with the underlying packages, which I have seen as broken scripts and other things. Just be aware of that. If you're running this in production, you probably want to run a test system with some of your things, just to make sure you don't break too much. Sometimes it says, yeah, there's Linux images, you have to have a root password set. Proxmox 7 changes how the Linux network devices are named. So it'll change the names on potentially some network cards. And it looks like it changes some of the PCI Express devices' IDs for some devices. So nothing that looks like it'll be relevant for this specific install. So it looks like I am ready to proceed. The cool thing they added is they added a little checklist script. So PVE 6 to 7. So let's go run that right now. I have this logged in via the command line, so I can do PVE 6 to 7. It says everything has passed and it skipped a few things due to it not being running in a cluster and not being a hyperconverged node. So it looks like it's ready to go. So let's go follow that guide and see how it goes. So first of all, we're just going to do an apt update to make sure the list of packages is fully up to date, and then an apt upgrade to upgrade any needed packages. I have done this before, so it is expected. There's nothing I need to upgrade. Now it's going to upgrade the Debian repositories to Bullseye, so that's going to tell it to use the newer version of Debian under the hood, which is what Proxmox is running on. And this is just changing the sources of list. Now we are going to be adding the Proxmox repository. So now I'm going to run apt dist upgrade. So this is going to actually upgrade my distribution in it, which tells Debian to essentially replace all the packages with the new ones in a newer repository. This can take a little bit. They say about 5 minutes for an SSD system. I have an old hard drive, so it might take a little bit longer. And it looks like it's downloading all the files, probably about 1 gig worth of files it's downloading. and then it's going to just essentially replace all the files in there. So I finished the upgrade. It took about 15 minutes total on this older i5-2400 system with a mechanical hard drive, so really not bad for an upgrade. I'd say much better than like Windows typically would be. Can't complain there. I finished rebooting it. It's booted successfully back. Here's the web interface. It now says beta. It says 7.0-4 on it. Everything looks fine. I can SSH into the system. I can run like uname -A to see its new kernel version. It's the exact same kernel version that I got when I installed from the installer. This all looks fine. Let's go fire up some of these VMs and see how well they're running. The most interesting one would be the one that's hibernated, so to see if I can just keep them in hibernation. Proxmox says all the VMs should just work perfectly fine after an upgrade, but Camus has made a few changes and stuff under the hood, so we're gonna double check. Yeah, and yep, there it goes. That's the Windows 10, started right up. No storage. I haven't done any configuration of this since I just turned it back on. I can play with it a little bit more, but it looks like it was about as painless of an upgrade as you can get. And I'd say overall, the dot guide is about as good as you'd want. I have a little script to double check everything. They have a pretty good list of things you want to double check for as well. And then a pretty simple guide of what to copy and paste in and have it just upgrade. So this is pretty good for me when it comes to upgrading your OS. So that was most of my quick look at Proxmox version 7. Overall, it's a pretty small upgrade, I'd say. Nothing major has changed. The UI is about the same. And the big thing is there's a few differences to versions under the hood. A few new features have been added to the graphical user interface. Some storage has been updated. BTRFS support has been added. And I think it continues to be a great product for what it is. I kind of put a few thoughts together on some of the features I'd like to see. To my knowledge, these features aren't included, but let me know if you know how to do them, or if they are included. And most of these should be relatively easy, except for, well, the biggest one I'd like is better GPU support. I'd really love if there was a way to do partially some VDI. I don't know of any KVM-based hypervisor that does like app VDI. So for example, like Hyper-V and VMware, Horizon, and Citrix can do it, so you have like an app on a like Windows PC, but it's really a virtual machine running that program in the cloud. In general, Linux isn't great when it comes to desktop virtualization, but I'd love to see them give that a better shot. It would be a lot of work, I know. Also, things like GPU partitioning support, and things using like SOIOV and the NVIDIA vGPU stuff on supported hardware would be cool. I know that would be a pain and a lot of work though for them. For the stuff that should be easier, permissions improvements, I've done a bit with multi-user on Proxmox, and I'd say it's reasonable for like a group of sysadmins that you kind of trust everyone, but I wouldn't want to use it in like a public cloud or even for like a group of people I don't really trust. So things like network permissions, so I can give someone a network and they can only use that network. To my knowledge, there's no way to limit that currently. And also quotas for like CPUs and RAMs. I can say, hey, you can allocate up to like 20 virtual CPUs, or use 20 CPUs worth of time, and maybe up to like 40 gigs of RAM on the hardware, and that's it. I know you can do some of that disk stuff with like ZFS and quotas, so disk is easier, but those, to my knowledge, is no easy way to do. To like split a single host into multiple people and say, hey, even if they've tried to use everything, they couldn't. Next thing, Hyper-V does this, and I wish they'd add it. And it seems pretty easy. So they automatically would pause all your running VMs when you reboot it. So then if you have to reboot for upgrades or shut down and change a hardware piece, it'll just pause it, and then when you turn it back on, it resumes everything. Not really needed. You should set up VMs so they just automatically start, but sometimes it can be nice and just saves you a little bit of time. And since they've added hibernation already and like suspend the disk, it should be pretty easy to add. And the next thing I'd like to see that they have been improving quite a bit is better backup and snapshot timing. To my knowledge, in the GUI, the most you can do is a backup a day, and there's a lot of applications where I'd like to be able to do it maybe once an hour. And now that PBS is a thing with Proxmox backup servers, so you can actually do incremental backups, you can have a backup that might only take 5 minutes, so doing it every hour kind of makes sense. And they've definitely added a lot, because the previous backup solution before PBS was not great, I'd say, as it would just make a full image and didn't do any of that. So now it's pretty good. And the snapshotting, there's no current way to automate snapshots. You have to manually click it. It'd be cool if you could automatically do it maybe once a day and keep the last week's worth. Though backups essentially do the same thing, but just on different storage, where snapshots use the same storage. That'd be cool to just see the option. Otherwise, it's a pretty good hypervisor. I've used it in multiple different deployments, been quite happy about my results. It's been pretty stable. I've never had issues where I've like bricked a system with it. And the other thing I love is because it is Debian under the hood with Commute and Linux KVM, I can fix a good amount of these just by scripting it myself. And I've written a reasonable amount of small scripts and just tweaked config files to change it. And also, since it's just Linux, I can do Linux stuff on it too. So I've done things where you can just, copy files on the host or run little scripts, which ESXi makes it a bit harder, and also just more people, a lot more familiar with Linux under the hood than like ESXi's. So I'm actually quite happy about it, and I'm glad we're pretty happy with 7. I think it's not a major change, but I don't think they need one. I kept trying to think of more big features I'd like, and really, I'm happy with Proxmox. So happy with this update. Seems the beta is pretty good from what I've seen. I'm going to wait for the final version and start updating my main server, just so that they have more time to squeeze out all the bugs. Hopefully that'll come out soon, and thanks for watching this little look at Proxmox 7 beta.